Jim, a very good morning. How are things with you today?
Things are very well, thank you. I'm going to start with a sentence I never thought I would utter, which is, thank God for the House of Lords.
Okay, tell me more.
Well, it looks as if the House of Lords are going to scupper the terrible assisted suicide bill.
Ah, yes, I saw that. That's really encouraging news because it looked rather ominous for a while.
It did. It looked inevitable, but I have to say the Lords have done very well. So.
And I'm sure you're also delighted because the Green Party won a great victory as well yesterday.
Well, I wouldn't say I'm overjoyed by that, but what a crazy coalition, of white liberal women and the Islamic parties. I mean, it is astonishing.
There we go. Maybe a sign of things to come. But Jim, we're going to get straight into our material today. We've been doing a season on the rise of Christian nationalism. And in the 5 episodes so far, we've covered a lot of ground. The politics of the post-war period, the rise of ethno-nationalism in response to mass immigration, and the increasingly popular dark pagan ideas of the manosphere among young men who feel alienated from contemporary culture. And in our last episode, we surveyed the state of Christian nationalism in the United States. But you've called this episode Defining Christian Nationalism. And I guess the obvious question listeners may have is, why didn't we do this episode right at the beginning of this season? Why are we waiting until now?
That is a very good question. But my biggest frustration in researching this topic has been the lack of a commonly accepted definition of Christian nationalism. Every attempt at a critique is met with a scornful, well, that's not what I mean by Christian nationalism. So if I had laid out the definition in our first episode, it would have been immediately dismissed. But hopefully, because we've spent a long time analysing the political scene, we'll be able to back up the definition with real-world data.
In our last episode, you identified 2 forms of Christian nationalism, and they both exist in the United States. So you called the first one the Theo Bros variant. This is the Christian nationalism of Stephen Wolfe and Doug Wilson, Brian Sauvé, Eric Kahn, and Joel Webbon. And you've argued that it has its roots in the reformed political theology of the 17th century, with its concept of a Christian prince who would rule a Christian nation in accordance with Christian principles.
Yes, I argued last week that this variant arose when the steam began to run out of the young restless reform movement of the early 2000s. A group of pastors tried to hijack that movement. In order to build their social media platforms, they forged links with the pagan manosphere, and in so doing, introduced tens of thousands of young Christian men into that nihilistic, misogynistic, and conspiratorial world. Many of them embraced the anti-Semitism of Nick Fuentes as a result. And as I said last time, a split developed among the Theo Bros. Pastors like Doug Wilson and James White tried to draw a line between their position and anti-Semitism by issuing the so-called Antioch Declaration. The radical Theo Bros like Joel Webbon and Eric Kahn will probably end up sharing the same lunatic asylum inhabited by Candace Owens. But the real damage they have done is to poison the minds of a generation of young reformed men. They've turned them into young, restless fascists.
The second variant of Christian nationalism you identified in the US is much more visible. You call it the Christian MAGA Alliance. It shares the same historical ideas as the Theo Bros version, but refracted through the ideology known as Christian Reconstructionism, made popular by James Rushdoony. Rushdoony's ideas were picked up within the charismatic movement in the form of the 7 Mountains Mandate. Perhaps the best-known figure in the Christian MAGA Alliance was Charlie Kirk.
And the key difference between the 2 variants is that the Christian MAGA Alliance is a fusion of Christianity with powerful political unbelievers. There's no attempt to have a Christian prince. Rather, Christians have lashed themselves to a political movement that shares many of their aims. Unfortunately, the MAGA movement has become infected with the dark Nietzschean ideas of the manosphere. So the Christian influencers who have been cheerleading for the MAGA movement have led hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of young Christians into an alliance with something that will ultimately be seen as pagan.
So that's where we finished at the end of our last episode. But we have one piece of business to complete before we define Christian nationalism, don't we, Jim?
Yes, last week's episode was so ridiculously long that we had to cut it short. If listeners want to get immediately to the definition part of this episode, I suggest they skip the next 10 to 15 minutes. The 2 variants we have discussed so far both live in the world of Protestantism. The third and final variant that operates in the US today comes from Catholicism, and it is very significant. because of the social power held by Catholics in the US today. The technical term for Catholic nationalism is a thing called integralism. But we've already thrown too much jargon at our listeners, so I'm going to use the more understandable term, post-liberalism.
Can you set out the history and beliefs of Catholic post-liberalism for us?
Okay, well, let's go back to the 60s, when the Catholic Church convened what is called the Second Vatican Council, Vatican II. That was the 21st Ecumenical Council of the Catholic Church. And it was designed to modernize the Church, to define how it would live in the modern world. And Vatican II produced a document called Dignitatis Humanae, which recognized universal religious freedom. The new approach offered support for democracy. It forbade religious coercion and introduced a whole raft of religious freedoms for other religions. So it looked, back in the 1960s, as if Catholicism had accepted pluralism. But Catholic scholars quickly identified how the post-war consensus would bring disaster to the West. These critics became known in academia as post-liberals because they saw liberalism as the Church's greatest enemy. Liberalism was defined as the idea that, we're autonomous individuals living in an atomized society, free to define our own existence and meaning, under the moral authority of no one. Now here we come to the first big difference between Catholic post-liberalism and the two Protestant variants. Post-liberalism has a lot of serious intellectual heft behind it. A lot of very serious Catholic scholars have written insightful critiques of modern society. And the interesting thing is that they don't blame the post-war consensus for the woes of the West. They go back much further in history to the Enlightenment. You see, according to Catholic scholars, liberalism is the political outworking of Enlightenment ideas that emerged during the French Revolution. It's true that the aftermath of the Second World War served as a cultural tipping point for the liberal narrative. But the roots are older than that. And I think they're 100% right in that analysis. But we will obviously disagree with the next step in their analysis because they ask, where did all these ghastly Enlightenment ideas come from? These ideas, about the autonomy of the individual, the rejection of institutional authority, the atomized society. Well, say the Catholic scholars, it came from the Protestant Reformation. The whole slide of Western culture into the mess that it's in today, they say, can be traced back to the Reformers' idea of the priesthood of all believers. The idea that each individual can interpret the Bible for himself, the doctrine of sola scriptura, they say is the root of all our woes.
And as Protestants, obviously, we disagree with that analysis, but it does raise the point that the doctrine of sola scriptura does seem to be under a lot of pressure at the moment.
Oh yes, the rise of self-confident, well-informed Catholic apologists has put considerable pressure on Protestants to defend their theology. That whole subject, Ollie, I have to warn you, will probably be the basis of our next season of the podcast, so we're not going to dive into it now. But for our purposes now, it's enough to say that an intellectually heavyweight critique of Vatican II's Dignitatis Humanae grew within American Catholicism. Liberalism was the enemy, so the Church had to embrace post-liberalism. Now, at first, the post-liberals were left-wing. They're more Bernie Sanders than Donald Trump. The early pioneers wanted to supplant free market liberalism with a new economic order. But gradually, Donald Trump was seen as a potential saviour. Young Catholics were attracted to his authoritarianism. They saw his potential as someone who could tear down the liberal, rules-based international order. Some positioned Trump as a post-liberal, a new Constantine. And that explains why an astonishing number of the Christians in the Trump administration are Catholic.
Tell us then, what is the Catholic vision for a post-liberal society?
Well, to answer that, we need to think about the Catholic view of the papacy. One of the main differences between Catholic and Protestant expressions of nationalism arises because in Catholic thought, the Church is a global institution based in Rome. So the Church is called to seek the spiritual governance of the whole world. And that is a hard thing for Protestants to get their head around. So let me just quote you a statement from Pope Pius XI. He said, "God has set down the chair of his vicar on earth in this city of Rome, which, from being the capital of the wonderful Roman Empire, was made by him the capital of the whole world, because he made it the seat of a sovereignty which, since it extends beyond the confines of nations and states, embraces within itself all the peoples of the whole world." What a hubristic statement. But anyway, The Catholic Church is a global institution. It's a political order. It creates laws and administers grace to secure the salvation of the whole human race. Now, that raises the question about how the state and this universal religious institution should coexist. And in Catholic thought, society actually has two supreme political authorities, the Church and the state. Now, notice how different that is from the Protestant view that our citizenship is in heaven. Catholics have twin allegiances to two earthly political authorities, their national state and the Vatican in Rome. But Catholic postliberalism actually goes further than that. The state is charged with maintaining good order. Okay, that's fine, but Catholics say it's not strong enough to stand up against the spiritual darkness that pervades the world. So the Church has to infuse political power with divine favour. The Church is said to be the soul that animates the body of the state. The Church initiates and the state responds.
Does that not mean that the Church is superior to the state, even in earthly matters?
Oh, yes, it does. The spiritual power surpasses the temporal power. So the Church may direct states to enforce law. The post-liberal vision really does bring us back to medieval Christendom, when the Pope had enormous legal, judicial and administrative powers. I mean, just think of how extensive canon law was, or the papal decretal system. That effectively made the Church the supreme legal authority. So the government doesn't just have to submit to the Pope and bishops alone, but to this entire administrative state, including councils, committees and courts. It's jaw-dropping stuff. We end up with a decisive move away from liberal democracy and much closer to the sort of bureaucratic rule seen in modern China.
Before we move to our main focus in this episode, how would you contrast Catholic postliberalism with the Theo Bros and the Christian MAGA alliance versions of Christian nationalism that you've outlined?
Well, perhaps the most substantive critique of Stephen Wolfe's book, that's the case for Christian nationalism, the most substantive critique comes from Catholic academics. Wolfe's book sets out what we've been calling the Theo Bros version of Christian nationalism. And we might summarise the difference by telling the story of the Prince and the Pope, which sounds like a pretty rubbish bedtime story for children. But anyway, so as I said a few minutes ago, the Catholic vision subordinates the state to the Church. Now, Wolfe, on the other hand, subordinates the Church to the state. So in his vision, the Christian prince becomes the mediator between God and man. As a Protestant, Wolfe sees the Church as a collection of local assemblies that might one day merge into a national church. But he flat out rejects the Catholic notion of the Church as a global institution. So in Wolfe's vision, the Church has no coercive power. Well, says the Catholic critic, that means that the Christian prince is a despot. Because Protestant denominations are so diffuse, unity can only be centred on the prince. Temporal authority becomes the principle of unity. And if I understand the Catholic critique correctly, the concern is that Wolfe's vision leads to unrestrained tyranny. There's nothing to stop the rise of Nietzsche's Overman.
How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, Wolfe would say that the Christian prince is restrained by Scripture, because the Theo Bros want the nation to be ruled by Old Testament laws. So Wolfe would say that his version of Christian nationalism is ruled by Scripture, while Catholic postliberalism is ruled by Rome. But I think the postliberals are right to point out that the likelihood of unrestrained authoritarianism in the Theo Bros scheme is very real. On the other hand, the Catholic vision is even more likely to lead to authoritarianism at a global scale. It is interesting, Ollie, if you think about the book of the Revelation, when it describes the rise of the Antichrist, it sees tyranny as a dual authority, the beast and the false prophet. The Bible sees all its warnings about the fusing of religious and political power come to this hideous climax just before Christ returns. And the tyranny in place at that time takes the form of global political power allied with global religious power. So I don't take any comfort in the Catholic vision of what's called two swords, Christian nationalism.
Okay, and what about how Catholic postliberalism compares with the Christian MAGA alliance version of Christian nationalism?
Well, as I said last week, the Christian MAGA alliance is populist. It's all about big rallies and celebrities and social media influencers. Catholic postliberalism, on the other hand, is much more cerebral. We sometimes forget that Catholicism in the US has a very considerable institutional power. is a power structure that commands the respect of the elite. I mean, MAGA populists may throw up high-profile politicians, the odd billionaire, but evangelicals have very little traction in academia or the judiciary or in the corridors of power. Do you know that 2/3 of the US Supreme Court are Catholic? It's not surprising that J.D. Vance converted from an evangelical background to Catholicism when he entered Yale. And the game plan for Catholic post-liberals is to take over all the major institutions of the state and then nudge the US into becoming a Catholic state. And I think they are better placed than the Protestant nationalists to achieve their goal. A new Catholic Christendom may arise from the ashes of liberalism, and if that vision becomes reality, its path will have been paved by the Theo Bros and the Christian MAGA alliance.
You've outlined three main strands of Christian nationalism then in the United States: the Theo Bros' desire for a Christian prince, the Christian MAGA alliance, and Catholic Postliberalism. The time has now finally come, Jim, for you to provide us with your definition of Christian nationalism. This is a big moment. I'm sure all our listeners are on tenterhooks. But before you do, Jim, we'll just build it up a little bit more. Why has this been hard to come to?
Well, as I said earlier, the conversation on this topic is horribly confusing because commentators use such broad definitions. Al Mohler, the president of the Southern Baptist Theology Seminary, said recently that anyone who disagrees with trans ideology is a Christian nationalist. Well, that's nonsense. Or at least it's a definition that's so wide that it can serve no useful analytic purpose. And then I saw a hit piece broadcast by CNN on Christian nationalism last week. They announced in horrified tones that Christian nationalists believed that the US was rooted in Christianity. Well, if that's Christian nationalism, sign me up. But it's not. Christian nationalism is a project designed to achieve political domination. And I have to say the people who frustrate me the most are the influencers who deliberately hide behind an innocent and harmless definition, even though they're pursuing a much harder agenda. It's impossible to engage with people who speak with a forked tongue. So, here we go. At least for our purposes, I'm going to define Christian nationalism using three broad themes. I want to think about their concept of a nation, their vision for society, and their political methods. So, let's begin with the Christian nationalists' concept of a nation. Their conception of nationhood can be expressed as two big principles. The first is that a nation manifests the kingdom of Christ in concrete form. Just as Israel in the Old Testament was a holy nation, so a Christian nation is a structural element of Christ's kingdom. The religious and political aspects of the nation are two sides of the same coin, and the coin is a politico-religious structure which forms part of the kingdom of Christ. So the nation's identity, heritage, values, norms, and laws are built from and controlled by Christianity. Now, perhaps the best way to explain this is to contrast that vision with a civic nation. A civic nation builds bonds between peoples of different faiths and no faith, using civic virtues like civility, fairness, neighbourliness, and reciprocity. A civic nation upholds freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It's bound by a shared understanding of the common good and a common commitment to the rule of law. So, if you want a simplistic strapline, we might say that a civic society offers a level playing field and agreed rules of the game. But a Christian nation is a game played by Christians for Christians. The rules of the game are Christian. Christian nations are regarded by their architects as structural elements within the kingdom of Christ. The nation is not a gift of common grace given to humanity to promote order and human flourishing. It's designed to manifest the kingdom of Christ in concrete form.
Okay, so that's your first principle. Christian nations are designed from the ground up to be an element within the kingdom of Christ. Do you think we can see that principle in operation when we look at the three strands of Christian nationalism that you've identified in the US today?
Oh, yes. Stephen Wolfe, who articulates the Theo Bros variant, talks openly about making it a crime to break the Sabbath. Heresy and blasphemy would be illegal in his scheme. The Nicene Creed would be inserted into the Constitution. Or then think about Catholic postliberals. They say publicly that their first step is to turn the US into a Catholic state under the rule of Rome. And the leaders of the Christian MAGA alliance repeatedly assert that America is a Christian nation. Now, the point here is a really subtle one. Christian nationalists aren't just claiming a Christian heritage for their nation, nor are they simply saying that Christianity built the foundation on which the nation's civic values rest. They're not even saying that they want the nation's customs, norms, and laws to be infused with Christian values, because all right-minded Christians want those things. We want our Christian heritage to be respected. We want liberals to acknowledge that our most precious values emerged from a Christian foundation. We want a society that's infused with Christian values. You can have all those things, but still have a level playing field. The concept of a Christian nation goes much further than heritage, foundationalism, and infusion of values. It's a concept of a nation that rejects the notion of a civic society bound together by common virtues and the rule of law. A Christian nation is built from the ground up as a politico-religious institution. It is nothing less than a part of Christ's kingdom.
So we're still thinking about this theme of nationhood, asking what is the Christian nationalist concept of a nation? But tell us now, Jim, the second principle.
The second principle is perfectionism. I mean, we might call it utopian thinking. To explain myself, think about the normal way people think of nations. Nations rise and fall. I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with Shelley's brilliant poem called Ozymandias. It's about a traveller who comes across this broken statue in the desert. The statue is of a ruler from some long-forgotten empire. And Shelley writes, "And on the pedestal these words appear, My name is Ozymandias, King of kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. No thing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare. The lone and level sands stretch far away." I don't know if you like that, but
I was enjoying. I was hoping you'd keep going there, Jim. Is that the end?
Yes, that is the end.
That's disappointing.
I think it's a brilliant illustration of the principle that nations rise and fall, and these great nations, after a while, are just forgotten. They're lost in the sands of time. Anyway, Nebuchadnezzar's dream, remember, warned him of exactly that fate. Empires always end up in the dustbin of history, and he was so upset by it that he in the next chapter he builds a statue made from head to toe with gold. Anyway, because Christian nationalists believe they're building an element of Christ's kingdom, they have a much more utopian vision, whether it be Doug Wilson's postmillennialism, or the New Apostolic Reformation movement's triumphalism, or Make America Great Again. The Christian nationalist vision for a nation isn't just a thing to maintain order and support human flourishing. It's a structure that will end in perfection.
So the Christian nationalist concept of a nation can be expressed in two principles that you've outlined so far. Firstly, the nation is an element of the kingdom of Christ, and it will not fade away, but will be a vehicle that will bring us closer to the perfection of Christ's kingdom. That's the second principle, perfectionism. The second of our three broad themes is the Christian nationalist vision for society. Could you tell us what that looks like?
Yeah, so we've done their concept of a nation. Let's now think about their vision for society. And here's the thing. Christian nationalists think that the nation shouldn't just be concerned with people's earthly well-being. The nation should do everything it can to maximize its citizens' heavenly good. So there is no concept of the common good, as a set of goods negotiated between people with wildly different worldviews. Christian nationalists think that unbelievers don't really have the capacity to understand what's in their best interests. So it's up to Christians to use political coercion to guide them into the right paths. Because Christianity is true and other religions are false, then it is in everyone's heavenly interest that Christianity gets preferential treatment. And I can best explain this using the language of the Ten Commandments. So it's traditional, as you know, to split the Ten Commandments into two tablets. The first 4 commandments are on the first tablet, and the next 6 are on the second tablet. Now, the idea that the state should base its laws on the second tablet is relatively uncontroversial. Those commandments are about the sanctity of life, family, integrity, and civil life, and so on. But Christian nationalists argue that the commandments on the first tablet should also be legislated. And those are the ones that deal with idolatry or Sabbath keeping. And this brings us back to the Christian nationalist vision for society. A Christian nation is tasked with ensuring its citizens' heavenly as well as their earthly good. So it will have laws that penalise the promotion of false religions. There will be blasphemy laws, punishments for heretics. Mosques and Hindu temples will have to be discreet, anonymous buildings that don't draw attention to themselves in the public square. Why? Because it's the state's job not only to keep the peace and maintain justice, no, the state must look out for everyone's heavenly good, because only Christianity has the moral resources to achieve social cohesion.
And is there any more to their vision for society than what you've outlined there?
Yeah, there are 2 more principles. And the term postliberalism is helpful here. Christian nationalists seem prepared to jettison some of the most cherished aspects of a liberal democracy. I mean, think of freedom of speech, or freedom of religion, or think about the checks and balances in the Constitution to limit the exercise of power. Christian nationalism is prepared to dispense with these concepts and move to a much more authoritarian society. The argument from Protestants is that the Christian prince will be constrained by Scripture. The argument from Catholics is that Rome is a benign mother who will always have the citizens' interests at heart. In our previous episodes, we were very critical of the sort of negative liberalism that produced the atomized society. That was a society with no shared values, just a collection of individual consumers in a global marketplace. But it seems to me that Christian nationalism is throwing the baby out with the bathwater here, because there are some really hard-won rights that have been enormously beneficial to citizens of liberal democracies. We're going to think about that next week when we critique this. But for now, all we're doing is defining Christian nationalism, and one key aspect of its vision for society is a willingness to embrace authoritarianism. The Christian MAGA alliance has already had to make its peace with President Trump's willingness to tear down a lot of the invisible fabric that holds liberal democracies together. The first point I want to make about Christian nationalists' vision of society isn't a positive idea that they have. It's more of a missing piece of the jigsaw. Forgive me, Ollie, for mentioning the dreaded post-war consensus again. But Christian nationalists are quite right to criticise the way that our society has privatised Christianity. The myth of the neutral public square has become so powerful that Christians aren't allowed to, mention their worldview in any debate over public policy. We saw that in the recent debates over assisted suicide in the UK. Christians in Parliament had to focus on the practical problems with the legislation. But the moment they dared to raise the issue of personhood, they were hauled down by leftists who told them to keep religion out of it. Now, given that lamentable state of affairs, we might expect Christian nationalism to hold out a vision for society which supports what we might call engaged pluralism. By that I mean create a social context in which different worldviews aren't just tolerated, but where they can be debated and discussed in a respectful manner. But no, Christian nationalists have no interest in that sort of society. They instead propose to use political coercion to press the mute button on any non-Christian beliefs. They openly propose to enact a form of Christian exclusivism.
Okay, so you've outlined three principles that encapsulate Christian nationalism's vision for society. First, the state must also look out for everyone's heavenly good, not just their earthly good. Second, there is a turn towards authoritarianism. And thirdly, the aim is to promote Christian exclusivism rather than engaged pluralism.
Yes. So we've thought about the Christian nationalist concept of a nation and their vision for society. And the final theme I want to think about is their political methodology. So how, in practical terms, will Christian nations be created? And I return to the headline I've used throughout this series. Christian nationalism is a project designed to achieve political domination. It employs political power to further its goals. It demands that the nation should be governed by Christians. The government of a Christian nation should be run by Christian leaders who control national institutions. And those institutions must treat Christianity as normative and foundational.
And you believe this is the key distinctive of Christian nationalism, don't you? The use of political power to achieve its ends.
Well, the Catholic Postliberals are entirely open about that because they believe that Rome has ultimate authority over every state. Catholics believe in a two swords doctrine, in which the church as well as the state wields the sword. The Theo Bros vision even includes, unbelievably, the possibility of a political revolution to achieve power. Some men like Doug Wilson favour a bottom-up approach, but even in Wilson's scheme, the end game is political domination. It's in the name after all. They call themselves dominionists. The Christian MAGA alliance is an obvious use of political power. Christians have lashed themselves to politically powerful unbelievers like Donald Trump to further their goals. It's an obvious fusion of religion and political power. So you're right. The key distinctive of Christian nationalism is its use of political power to achieve its ends.
Okay, so we can now summarize your definition of Christian nationalism in 6 principles. So get your pencil and notepad out, and I'm going to go through them one by one. Firstly, in terms of the Christian nationalist concept of a nation, Christian nations are designed from the ground up to be an element within the kingdom of Christ. The nation's identity, heritage, values, norms, and laws are built from and controlled by Christianity. A nation is not a civic institution. It is meant to manifest in concrete form the kingdom of Christ. Principle 2. Christian nationalists see the nation in perfectionist terms. They don't see their nation as just one more entity that rises and falls into the dustbin of history. The dominionist vision is utopian. Principle 3. In terms of the Christian nationalist vision for society, the state must look out for everyone's heavenly good, not just their earthly good, because only Christianity has the moral resources needed to create a cohesive society. Principle number 4. Little respect is given to the core features of a liberal democracy, like freedom of religion and expression. Christian nationalism involves a turn towards authoritarianism. Principle 5. The aim is to promote Christian exclusivism rather than engaged pluralism. And finally, Principle 6. In terms of method, Christian nationalism employs political power to further its goals. It demands that the nation should be governed by Christians.
Good. So we've got there. We've arrived. The nation is conceived to be a religious rather than a civic institution. It is to be built and governed by Christians using political power. And next week, we will critique these 6 principles. But I hope to do so fairly, because I'm conscious that it's very easy to throw rocks at Christian nationalism. But the truth is that this whole debate is only live because our society is in such terrible trouble. So anyway, once we've done a theological critique, we will then assemble some answers ourselves.
In the past 2 episodes, we've concentrated heavily on the United States, but back in episode 2, we did talk about the situation in Europe when we discussed the question of immigration. How would you characterize Christian nationalism in Europe?
Well, according to our technical definition, there really is no substantial form of Christian nationalism in Europe, in the sense that there's no big project designed by Christians to achieve political domination. What we do have here is a form of Christian identitarianism. In episode 2, I talked about Christians who feel aggrieved and oppressed by a secular elite who seem determined to tear down Christian culture. I invented a rather lame, mean-spirited joke about cultural grievance Bible thumpers. And I invented that ridiculous term because it shortens to the acronym CGBT. And the CGBT community adopts precisely the same political posture as the LGBT community. They are an oppressed minority whose identity is being systematically erased by a cultural hegemony. And the big risk I identified in that earlier episode was that aggrieved Christians in Europe and here, particularly in the UK, would be tempted to ally themselves with the ethno-nationalists like Tommy Robinson. Now, I think that is a really serious risk. In his 1886 work called Beyond Good and Evil, Nietzsche warned that in battling darkness, evil, or intense conflict, one risks adopting the same malevolent traits that they are opposing. And he famously said this is a brilliant quote. He who fights with monsters might take care lest he hereby become a monster. And if you gaze for long into an abyss, the abyss gazes also into you. Isn't that fantastic?
I think this, alongside your poem earlier, Jim, potentially there's space for some sort of audio book that we could imagine going to sleep at night just listening to your dulcet tones in my ears.
I don't think you'd want to go to sleep with the thought that the abyss is gazing also into you.
Yeah, maybe a more positive, uplifting poem.
Anyway, this is the risk facing Christians in the UK. We've been battling for so long against this monstrous thing called identitarian politics that we risk becoming an instance of the monster, positioning ourselves as victims and playing the politics of grievance. Play that game for too long, and you'll end up rationalising the case for making an alliance with the ethno-nationalists. Anyway, next week we'll include Christian identitarianism in our critique, even though, strictly speaking, it isn't a form of Christian nationalism.
Why do you think we don't have the same kind of Christian nationalism in Europe as we're seeing in the US? I mean, the UK, for example, has an established church, the Church of England, and it would seem to give Christian nationalists a bit of a head start, wouldn't it?
Well, in theory, yes. The Anglican model is quite close to Stephen Wolfe's vision for Christian nationalism, because Henry VIII did a lot of the heavy lifting for him. But it is a laughable suggestion, because the established church in the UK is so aligned with the post-war consensus, it could never act as a conduit for post-liberalism. There are, of course, many fine, biblically sound Christians in the Anglican Communion, but the upper echelons of the Church of England are virtually apostate. the new Archbishop of Canterbury, promotes all the values of the progressive left. So any aspiring Christian nationalist in the UK would find the established church to be a hindrance rather than a help.
Well, on that note, Jim, it's time to conclude. We've defined Christian nationalism, and in our next episode, we'll focus on critiquing it. That's all for now. We'll see you again next week.